Good morning, everyone. We're here for a midterm exam review and some ideas that you might want to consider going forward in terms of writing your final research report, because the proposal is coming up in a couple of weeks. And as we go through the material, what I'd like to do is sort of invite you to consider some ideas that are generated partly from the module, but also some combinations with a couple of different modules, different ideas, different thinkers, and then applying that to kind of an original idea. Now, what I'd like to do at this point is shut myself off in terms of the camera so you can actually read the material. We're going to bring the screen up first with the writing, see if that works, and maybe, okay, that seems to be all right. Okay, so the midterm notes for SOSC-7043 The Big Lie. The first module that we looked at was actually module 2. The very first one was just a course introduction and a couple of secret words, right? Misinformation and disinformation. We'll get to those at the end. But what I want to do here is kind of go through what I collect at the end for the key points. And the first thing is that Plato is able to distinguish between who is lying and for what reason. So really, intentionality is important. The problem with Plato, though, is he has great difficulty creating a correspondence between reality and language. And he claims essentially that we cannot talk about things that do not exist, right? He calls them non-being. So we can't discuss these issues, these ideas, unless we have a reference, right? Some kind of reference point in the real world. So if we blend non-being into a conversation, then we may speak of false thinking. And if falsity exists, then deception is possible. So Plato is very concerned about the fact that we can lie to each other, lie to ourselves, and we do so by talking about things that essentially in his mind don't actually exist. So the question becomes, why would truth be so important to Plato? It's an awareness, almost a psychological awareness of what we do. Well, because for Plato, truth is very important, because that is a stepping stone towards wisdom, right? And it would be a contradiction in his mind to be both a lover of wisdom and knowledge and also a fan of falsehoods. So you cannot have both. It's one or the other. And clearly for Plato, any movement towards wisdom is right. Now, there were people in particular that Plato was very concerned with. They were, of course, the sophists, who were thinkers, who basically were kind of hired guns to teach people how to persuade one another through argumentation, right, to agree to a particular new law, or to repeal a law, or to change one's way of thinking or one's behavior. So sophists were able to use language persuasively. Plato really feared that because he thought, well, that's kind of my game, right? That's what I do. So I don't like it when others do it. So that should sound kind of familiar in the present day. So truth is important to Plato because it is the stepping stone towards wisdom, and anyone that is able to manipulate ideas and invite falsehoods are dangerous. So poets, for example, the power that they hold over language and meaning, and the way in which language can exceed meaning, and meaning can exceed language. So poetry produces this object that is actually removed 3 times from, in Plato's idea, the world. So you have idea 1, we have the actual thing as it exists in the world, table, tree, sunshine, whatever, or sun, I should say, is the thing, and then finally a painting or a sculpture of it. So reality for the visual arts and the written arts is 3 removed, right? Idea, thing in the world, and an image or representation of the world. And for Plato, that's very dangerous. So having said all of this, Plato thinks that, because we have this capacity, let's acknowledge it and maybe use it. So he says, look, we have the opportunity for falsehoods, the fabrication of, lies that are helpful. Now, in the modern world, we would call that a utilitarian way of thinking. And essentially, although Plato has never been called a utilitarian, he's doing exactly that. And what is he doing? He's fabricating a lie in order to sugarcoat a pill that he thinks society needs to swallow in order to come to terms with a situation that, according to those in power, aren't really explaining it very clearly. But they're doing it in such a way that it appeases and assuages and softens the blow of the reality. So it's couched in a kind of lie. So the noble lie, as the term implies, it's noble, exalted, it's looking up towards wisdom, but it's still a lie, regardless. So Plato also was someone who did not like the democratic thinking. He discredited democracy every time he could, and yet within this context of a new political structure, Plato invited the possibility of using falsities and illusions. And so with that in mind, the ability that we have to speak, to discourse with one another, to think of new ideas, what this ability that we have is the ability to tap into a political imaginary. And that is something that becomes very important, because when you shut that down, you now stop people from discussing alternative ways of living, new ways of living, better ways of living. And as much as democracy was about open discussion and dialogue, Plato thought, no, because we're now talking about things that don't exist. So yes, Plato was a huge paradox. He really was. He wanted people to move towards wisdom, yet at the same time was willing to use lies. But any words that we use, any ideas that we discuss need to be anchored in reality, as much as reality, comes into being and dissolves away. So it's unstable, it's subjective. So yes, Plato, very much a paradoxical figure. Now, I was thinking of an essay topic here. What about the possibility of how does the utilitarian goal of the noble lie differ from the political expediency of either post-truth, which is an idea that is discussed in one of our textbooks, or even science denial, right? Do they all ultimately seek to hide difficult truths? So that is something you could consider. You could explore that, and as you sort of collect information, you may wish to kind of sharpen the focus and say, well, let's look at the noble lie versus post-truth, right? That would be one idea. Okay, so that's Plato. Number 2 is Francis Bacon and his theory of idols. And with Bacon, we have, again, a character who is pushing against what has come before. And what has come before is the metaphysical ideas, the world of Aristotle, medieval scholastics, because scholasticism is a new form of Aristotle that links together theology and Aristotelian thinking. Go back and have a look at the slides if you like for more clarification. But the problem with scholasticism, it is a rigid, inflexible, uncritical combination of both theology and metaphysics. And it was taught in universities for hundreds of years. And basically it was the old my way or the doorway. But of course, the doorway led to the gallows, the being burnt at the stake. I mean, it was seriously dangerous. So what Bacon is hoping to do as both a thinker, kind of a part-time scientist, a politician, is he wants to push back on this, and he wants to create a kind of thinking that is based more on a naturalistic, materialistic kind of philosophy that is found using this, what he called the scientific method. And as much as he was presenting the scientific method as a kind of thinking that would be based always on a solid foundation, right? Let's make sure that what we start with is verifiable, provable, and then we move from there. So in so doing, Bacon, as he was trying to point out the issues and the errors of scholasticism, kind of rigid, uncritical thinking, he found out that, okay, we, in our own minds, have these, what he called idols, or he also called them phantoms, but ways of thinking that were seriously causing us to not see the world clearly. So he had these various idols, and what I want to do here is just have a quick look at each one of them. Idols of the tribe, right? So we think of tribe made up of people. So he's talking about the idols of people themselves, right? You and I. And here he's talking about those subjective tendencies in our human nature towards superstition, towards uncritical ways of thinking. and really trying to move away from this assertion in Greek philosophy that man is a measure of all things, right? This is something Protagoras had said, well, at that point, almost 2,000 years ago, so a very long time. So instead of man being the measure, how about let's make science the measure of all things? So that was the idol of the tribes. There's the one we looked at right here, idols of the cave. That refers to knowledge that results from, again, our subjective point of view. So if the idols of the tribe is ourselves, idols of the cave is us amongst others who think the same way. So we're all sort of huddled in a cave. It's a reference to Plato's sort of allegory of the cave. But for Bacon, it refers to that subjective view of the world that is based on education, what we read, well, who we consider to be an authority, which is very important, with whom we interact and their ideas. So really it becomes the movement of individuals sort of stepping out into the world with our predispositions or biases and prejudices of one sort or another, superstitions, and we move out and we start interacting with people. There we are in the cave. And we start to talk to one another, and we start to deal with philosophical ideas. Well, here we enter into the idols of the theater, right? These philosophical dogmas that are either very rigid or so artificially constructed that they become accepted forms of thinking. Why are they accepted? Because they're persuasive, right? So any kind of philosophical dogma that is persuasive, we need to always sort of step back and go, okay, this fits a little too easily, right? Let's be a little bit more critical, a little bit more skeptical. So we move from the tribe to the cave to the theater, and then finally we become aware of that which we are using to communicate with one another, and that is language. And now we move into the idols of the marketplace. Now you could again see whether, you could argue, I suppose, that in the same way that the idols of the cave is a dig at Plato's allegory of the cave, but idols of the marketplace could also be a bit of a dig towards the agora, right? In ancient Athens, the agora was this place where philosophers would come to discuss ideas. So the idols of the marketplace would be the slavish adherence that we have to language, this belief that language can be used correctly when in fact it can't, because if we think back to the idols of the tribe, we aren't, right? We are unaware that we have these predispositions, these biases, these superstitions, these tendencies. So in terms of an essay topic for Bacon, something to the effect of maybe how does Bacon's theory of the idols compare or contrast with current notions regarding cognitive biases, the willful ignorance, the motivated reasoning, these kinds of things that are in Lee McIntyre's book, science denialism, tribalism is another one, right? Identity politics, information silos that we all sit inside of, algorithmic bubbles. Each one of those are really modern terms or modern labels for Bacon's ideas, right? Of the tribe, of the marketplace, of the cave. So consider that. And then by the same token, what might be some remedies, right? That acknowledge and then help to overcome some of the limitations outlined in Bacon's theory of the idols. So that could be actually two different essay topics. But I leave it to you to see whether there's something you can sort of work with and combine together, because I think there is a lot in Bacon's work that is useful. Then in Module 4, we talked about the rise of atheism, libertinism, and skepticism. And this was a period of time in the 1700s, so the 18th century. Now, atheism has been around forever in various forms. Depending on how powerful the church was, it tended to be very quiet. It was often discussed in clandestine philosophy that we talk about in class. But atheists and skeptics and libertines were individuals who fought against the status quo of the day, right? The status quo being the church power, the monarchy, scholasticism, whatever seemed to be there, that was the order of the day, right? This is the way things are done. But what if? Those would be the skeptics, right? The libertines, the atheists. And so these particular texts, the libertine texts, for example, were critiques of religion and Christianity, not as a religion per se, but as a social and political institution, a very powerful one and a very dangerous one. Because if you are represented as an institution that thinks uncritically and decides that whatever you say goes. Obviously, anyone that thinks against you or sort of dissents in you from your opinion, they put themselves in great danger. So these free thinkers, right, that will be kind of a larger label under which atheists, skeptics, and libertines can be put in. So free thinkers were individuals who thought that superstition, any of those were actually now being used, right, being manipulated by that status quo, right, to keep people in place, to keep them uncritical, to keep them unthinking, to keep them fearful, right? So all forms of superstition were these kind of strategies that the ruling class and supporters used to keep people in their place and regulate that political order. So a kind of noble lie, but one based on superstition and biases and prejudices. That was essentially the status quo, and that was the target, right? The attack or the point of the attack by atheists and libertines. So libertine thinkers, they knew there also was that ongoing tension in the mind between that social imaginary, that political imaginary, and at the same time, a kind of submission to tradition, some kind of tradition. If you remember in class, I said, if you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right, you have nothing to compare progress with. If you start completely fresh, it's difficult to see whether there is progress. What could be saved and what could be changed? This was always the issue and the question that atheists, skeptics, and libertines were asking themselves. To what degree do I base my ideas on a traditional form of thinking, and where do I push, right, for new imaginary ideas and social formations and ways of life and so on? So freedom from all kinds of metaphysical thinking were necessary for this new critical form of reason to flourish. And once again, the Greeks had said the same thing. Without freedom, reason will be compromised, right? You have to have open debate. There has to be a degree of freedom in society and in the world for ideas to flourish. Because the moment you corrupt freedom, you corrupt reason. And the atheists and skeptics clearly knew that. So the time in question that we are discussing here, this is France in the 1700s, so the 18th century. And of course, these ideas eventually led to the French Revolution, so they were very powerful. France was characterized by a series of battles between science and theology, between theology and philosophy, but certainly science and philosophy were more or less on one side, and then metaphysical thinking, theological thinking was on the other. And theological thinking was based in this kind of authority, tradition based on revelation. All of these ideas were there, but what the status quo was doing, the powers that be was doing, was because they could control the narrative. They were the ones that were saying that these kinds of free thinkers are extremely dangerous. So it was the task for these writers was to create something new. And one of the new things that they did create was the possibility of a virtuous atheist, someone who understood virtue not as some attitude, but in fact in their behavior, what they did, right? So it was possible for Bale to discuss the possibility, right, of a virtuous atheist or a kind of positive atheism. So Bale's dictionary, as I discussed in the class, was the ability for Bale to discuss all these different ideas and point out some of their strengths. Now, of course, he would offset it with having another philosopher discuss the negative aspects. But if you read it carefully, you could see that Bale was at least offering the possibility of an alternative viewpoint on these otherwise dangerous ideas like atheism, skepticism, libertinism. So the main message of Bale's dictionary was that hubris, ultimately, right, the hubris of certainty, that is dangerous. The idea that you are so filled with pride in your position, your intellectual or metaphysical, philosophical position, you are so absolutely certain that you are not going to let anyone else, step in and converse about something else. But there's a degree of hubris which ultimately is dangerous. So instead of that hubris, that absolutely dogged certainty, maybe skepticism is the way to go, right? Because it would establish a foundation of human knowledge that would be based on a degree of certainty, not in the person, but a degree of certainty in the object being studied. So if you start with the material world and with matter, you're building on a solid foundation. But if you are basing it on simply the foundation of your certainty, well, at one point you're going to be open for debate. And so skepticism would be the way in which human knowledge would be founded on something much more solid. Now, in terms of an essay topic here, I was thinking of something to the effect of how has skepticism gone from the motivation to continue learning and searching, which goes as far back as Socrates and the ancient Greek philosophers, searching for answers, to simply doing your own research on the web. We know what that is, right? I looked up some websites and, the algorithmic configuration sent me down here. So is that still skepticism, that you're going to do your own research on the web? So how has skepticism as a critical tool in the search for the truth become a weapon used by political interests to favor one worldview at the expense of another? Is that not the hubris of certainty? Is that not exactly what Bale was warning us about? That just because you think that you're right doesn't make you right. And so that's really the argument. So in terms of an essay topic, you can either pose the question, how do we move from being a critical tool to individuals not understanding how skepticism works, but simply thinking that they find some alternative, that's good enough. Because skepticism needs to be applied to that as well. Okay, Module 5. We looked at Condillac and Tracy on French ideology. I call it French because the following module looks at the German ideology, specifically the way in which Marx looked at the German ideology and how it functioned. Now, in Module 5, we talk about the original notion of ideology as the science of the creation of ideas. And the first person we looked at was Condillac, right, who thought about the origins of language and the fact that the language of each individual culture has its own sort of specific flavor and character. And he believes it was determined by sometimes climate, definitely social conditioning, the need to communicate, the government, that held that society together. And really, what he's saying is the fact that language exists in a context will influence how that language develops. So he says, just as governments influence the character of nations, so the character of nations influences that of language. People naturally do not speak of things without revealing their interest in them. And that is something that is important in, for example, psychoanalysis. Years later, like some 100 and so years later, where our preoccupations with certain words, our continual use of a certain word indicates something about us. And so Condillac presents this for the first time, that perhaps we need to carefully think about the language we use because it says a lot about who we are, right? We're back to that hubris of certainty. So Condillac is the first one that takes the study of language and grammar and brings it down into a material or at least an empirical context. Now, Tracy follows Condillac's ideas, and he proposes this notion of languages as, yes, a system of individual signs, which is what words are, right? They indicate something, because he says all types of knowledge, really, that we have about ideas are still expressed and dressed up in signs, in speech. So speech is not this sort of abstract, ahistorical, forever, finished thing. It is continually changing. It is fluid. So it's not an ideal abstraction, right? It's grounded in the real for two reasons. Because human sensations and thoughts and feelings give birth to language in the first place. And two, the development of knowledge influences the development of speech. So against Plato's notion that we cannot talk about things that don't exist, both Condillac and Tracy say, no, absolutely. That's how knowledge grows. That's how that political imaginary comes into being. and is tapped into, and we think of new things. So through sense perception, feelings, thoughts, observations, we produce ideas which are expressed in language. And that's really a remarkable idea because it is the first time in the history of grammar and linguistics that thinkers now start to consider the context in which these words are spoken. So if language and knowledge comes through the senses, then we need to be aware of how that actually occurs. So we're all equal at birth, which with John Locke saying that we are born as a kind of blank slate, right? Our experiences create who we are. And as we are doing this, we are learning to speak. And as we are learning to speak, we are expressing those experiences and that we have been affected by, and the knowledge that we've gained by those experiences. But Condillac is also concerned with the fact that no matter how this occurs, we can never go outside of ourselves, right? For all we perceive is nothing more than our own proper thoughts. So now we're back to idols of the tribe, right? Hopefully you're seeing how these things all fit together. So in the same way that Bacon says the idols of the tribe has to do with us and our biases and prejudices, now he's talking about the way in which our ideas can be twisted or misshapen in some way by those biases. Both Condillac and Tracy are saying, yes, we cannot step out of ourselves, and we need to be mindful that when we create knowledge, we're creating knowledge with a language that we both need to share, but we have to make sure that we say what we mean and we mean what we say. So as a result of thinking about how a thought becomes a word, that space in between, that could be a nanosecond, or it could be a long time. Someone thinking and searching for the right word. Tracy decided that ideology, the creation of ideas, right, the science of the creation of ideas, that would be this new foundation. And it was known as ideologie for, again, a very long time throughout the majority of the early 1800s. This would be after the Revolution. And so ideology was the first time in which we were kind of studied in depth in terms of our capacity to judge, to speak, to desire. And that desire was particularly important because imagine following a revolution. Now we can ask for the first time, what do you want? What do you desire? What kind of world would you like to live in? And that political imaginary, that social imaginary kicks in. People begin to talk and discuss about new ways of life, new ways of living, new ways to express desires and wants and needs, but also mindful that we need to pick and choose our words carefully. So Tracy agrees with Locke that although knowledge is limited to our ideas and we cannot exceed them, we still have that capacity to carry further through in the labor of thinking, right? And this is that political imaginary that I talked about in that first set of slides in Module 2 when I talked about Plato and the noble lie and Plato's connection between words and reality. Well, sometimes we can think things into being. So for an essay topic here, something like is Tracy's definition of ideology as the science of the creation of ideas. How does it refer and how can we apply this science to a better understanding of the existence of science denialism, climate change, for example, or the overabundance of conspiracy theories? So there you could combine perhaps Bacon and his ideas of the marketplace, the ideas of I keep calling them ideas, idols of the tribe, idols of the cave, idols of the marketplace, and then combine that with Tracy's definition of ideology as the science of the creation of ideas, and then apply those to the situation we find ourselves in today, right? In the 21st century, with social media platforms that advocate without a hint of irony or hubris the existence of science being denied, conspiracy theories. How did this come to be? How did we end up in a position when we should know better? Like, how did it become so powerful? Okay, and then the last module that we're going to look at, I know I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I wanted you to have a look at this first to at least start formulating some ideas for the essay topic. So I'm going to go ahead and look at Marx because we haven't had the class and we won't have it till next week. But I want to at least show you what I will be speaking about. And compared to the other thinkers, again, Marx was a critical thinker, skeptical thinker. He understood the role of religion in society, but he also felt that a critique of religion had to be the foundation of all forms of critique. Why? Because that was the source of modern day superstitions, modern day prejudices, modern day biases. So he says that the bourgeois society held itself in awe. Again, the hubris of certainty, right? Going back to Bale, held itself in awe against certain reactionary and elusive ideas. So the bourgeois society elevates itself around the mid-1800s, so the 19th century, into a position of power. And of course, what happens when you get into a position of power? You want to hold on to that power. So you now start making sure that the conditions under which you are existing, economic and political, stay put and things don't change. So that particular kind of thinking that bourgeois way of life was good, that capitalism was good, industrialization was good, became for Marx a dangerous kind of ideology because it was allowing the economic forces of society to overtake and run the rest of society. So in other words, rather than society and economics, working hand in hand or in parallel, it seemed like technological innovations was getting ahead of human progress. So you end up with a situation where the human society in which we all live in, because we cannot live in anything else, it was now at the mercy of economic imperatives, right? Economic decisions. And some of them can be very dangerous because the end result is we have parts of the world that are being basically exploited for raw materials, and those raw materials are being delivered to another part of the world. But again, I digress at this point. The point here in the German ideology is it is a critique of the realm of pure thinking, right? Pure thinking, metaphysical thinking, at the expense of the real world. So what is happening in ideology, in a pejorative and in a negative way, is the realm of pure theory, pure speculation, pure philosophy is not anchored in the real world. And instead, all kinds of problems and contradictions are kind of flattened out in theory, but not in the real world. And that was the problem with ideology, is it worked out all of its problems, but only in ideas, not in the real world. And so when we look at the history of humanity, we end up seeing quite often ideologies, perhaps not described and defined in exactly those ways, amounting to a distorted conception, a distorted view of society, or at worst, a complete disconnection from it. So ideology viewed from a kind of Marxist lens is one in which a condition is created where ideas are moved from the top down. So you have thinkers that are thinking in the realm of pure theory and then creating an idea that will now be applied to society to allegedly advance it forward, but in fact, in terms of human progress, is now brought into question. So what Marx is saying here is the notion of ideology is a dangerous one because it not only tries to work out problems on a theoretical level, but it also becomes rigid. Once that idea is worked out, it becomes like scholasticism. It becomes uncritical. It becomes dogmatic. It becomes a kind of orthodoxy. So the nature of ideology becomes clear. Ideology appears in relation to history as a product, right? So a historical condition is brought into being, and ideology results from it. How do we get into this position? Rather than let's move history along this particular path. So that's why ideology appears in relation to history as a product, right? A result of, rather than a cause of history. Now, the cause of history for Marx is in fact economic development. So the economic movement of history, that is where you find changes. But what happens is those economic movements and changes advance at a certain rate, but the ideology that results from it seems to lag behind. And so we end up with this kind of upside down or reversed world that is really striking, because the image that Marx uses is the image of a camera obscura. And cameras, when they were first invented in the early 1800s, the image, when you could see it from behind, was actually upside down. So what was happening was ideology had turned the world upside down and implied that somehow that theoretical world was more real than reality itself, which almost sounds like Plato, doesn't it? But as a result, when those ideas are, these contradictions are worked out on the level of ideology, not so, because the reality is the other way around. The ideas now are brought from the top down in order to advance that economic part of society forward. And again, we as human beings are left further and further behind. Okay, so the question would be, how does all of this fit into an essay topic? Well, we could ask ourselves something like this. Given Marx's definition of ideology as being the reversal or the upside down of reality, how do we make sense of disinformation silos that spring up on social media? Because they too reverse reality, because they are the site of conspiracy theories and claims that the world is not what it is, and somehow a conspiracy theory that operates purely on a theoretical level, because it is called a conspiracy theory, it will explain the problem. But in fact, it doesn't. The problem does not go away. But somehow conspiracy theories present this condition. Oh, it was because of this. So if Marx's definition of ideology is the reverse of reality, how do we make sense of these disinformation silos that basically spew out conspiracy theories and how they spring up on social media, right? How does the capitalist pursuit of profits factor into maintaining one version of social reality over against another? So now this is the intention of certain theories over others. Can we ever overcome the possibility that for some people, ideology is ultimately more important than facts? When you think of the notion of post-truth, right? Post-truth is about feelings. So facts don't matter. Even if the crime rate in North America or in the US has dropped, the question is always, do you feel safe? Well, I don't know. But the facts are that crime has gone down. But it's about feelings. So can we ever overcome this possibility that ideology, well, I'm being told by the groups that I like and that I favor, that part of my disinformation silo, they say this. And that to me makes more sense, because that's kind of how I feel, despite the fact that it is quite otherwise.